23 years ago, I left Australia. I took a job as a fisheries scientist in a country just to the north of here, but it was a world away. As I travelled around the Solomon Islands, I was struck by the forested high islands, the conjunction of those high islands with coral cays and with the maze of coral reefs. As someone who'd grown up in Australia, I think I was even more struck by the subsistence lifestyle. Most people were still living, and still are, a subsistence existence. And as a fisheries scientist and a fisherman, I was really intrigued to see what an important role fish played in everyone's life. Several years later, I was lucky enough to take a job with the Secretary of the Pacific Community, and I got involved in studies on the role of fish in food security and coordinating an assessment of the vulnerability of fisheries and aquaculture across all the Pacific Island countries and territories. And it's that experience that I'd just like to share with you today as a basis for addressing the subject of this talk. Well, as it turned out, as you can see from this map here, in Solomon Islands, people are eating about, about twice the global average of fish consumption. Global average is around about 18 kilos per person per year. They're eating about double that. But as you can see, the rest of the region's often eating a lot more fish than that. Incredibly, in the small country of Tokelau, to 200 kilos per person per year, but in the order of 3 to 4 to 5 times the global average is not at all uncommon, or wasn't when we did this study. However, something is happening that's about to change all this. When I first went to Solomon Islands in 1993, there were 340,000 people in the country, and there were no accurate fish surveys to say how productive the reefs were, so a good proxy is from the literature is to say sustainable harvests from coral reefs, which support most of the coastal fisheries in the region, are about 3 tonnes per square kilometre per year. And as you can see from the figures there, that meant that Solomon Islands has a production of about a bit more than 25,000 tonnes of coastal fisheries a year, estimated. But look what's happening over time. Now the population is 600,000, and that fish availability is reduced from about 75 kilos per capita back in 1993 to a bit over 40. By 2035, it's going to be 25 kilos per head, and by 2050, it's going to be around about 20 kilos per head. What are the implications of this? The implications are that for those Pacific Island countries and territories which really don't have much scope for broadacre agriculture, really don't have many options to produce other sorts of animal protein, fish are an incredibly important source of protein. And the public health people at the Secretariat of the Pacific Community have recommended that under that context, Pacific Islanders should really plan to eat about 35 kilos of fish per person per year. Well, you can see what's going to happen in Solomon Islands. By 2035, the reefs, the coastal fisheries, will not be able to provide that amount of fish. There'll be a shortfall of about 10 kilos per person per year. By 2050, it'll go up to 14. Now, the region has taken this message on board, and across the region, they're putting in some pretty good plans to try to think of ways to provide at least 35 kilos of fish per person per year. But for those countries that have always eaten a lot more than that, their plans are to try to maintain those traditionally high levels of fish consumption. So a key question, obviously, is how could climate change affect these plans? And what we know from a range of studies now, the first by William Chung and others back in 2010, is really showing that in response to temperature alone, we're expecting the productivity of tropical species in equatorial regions to ebb away, to decrease by, well, he's showing here in his graph, in some places more than 40%. As part of the study that was done at the Secretary of the Pacific Community on looking at the vulnerability of fisheries and aquaculture to climate change, Morgan Pratchett from James Cook University led the chapter on what were likely to be the effects for coastal fisheries, and he used a broader approach. He looked not only at the direct effects of things like temperature change on growth rates and recruitment and survival and so forth, he also looked at the more indirect effects. Given that coral reefs support many of the coastal fish species, what was going to happen to those stocks as coral reefs degrade, as they're projected to, of course, under more frequent bleaching events with increasing sea surface temperature, and the effects of ocean acidification on calcification of reefs. And he came to the conclusion that by 2050, you're probably looking at about a 20% decrease in the productivity of coastal fisheries associated with coral reefs in the Pacific Island region. Well, coming back to Solomon Islands now, what this means in reality is that the gap that's going to emerge in the availability of fish per person, the difference between how much reefs can provide and the 35 kilos per person per year that's planned for, is actually going to be made wider by the effects of climate change. What can be done about this? Well, I think there's a very useful framework in the literature which is saying that, look, yes, we need to adapt to climate change, but often there are things in the more nearer to us and immediate things that are happening that we also need to adjust to, we need to adapt to. And I think I've just shown you that in the case of the availability of fish for food security, population growth is a very important driver. So ideally, we need to try to identify adaptations that are win-win adaptations, those that address near-term drivers and we make a gain from that in a way that will actually be resilient or perhaps even favoured by climate change in the longer term. If we need to, we can consider lose-win adaptations, things that are going to cost us something now, but will actually predispose us to adapt to climate change more effectively in the future. And the Pacific Island region is actually very fortunate because it does have options. I've spoken so far only about the coastal fisheries based on coral reefs. But the Pacific Island region has a huge tuna fishery. To put it in perspective, the total catch of tuna around Australia is, all species combined, is probably less than 20,000 tonnes. Here in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, they regularly harvest 2 million tonnes of skipjack tuna, and they have another 3 species in addition to that. So there's a huge resource there. And what that does is it does create an option, because if you look at these pie charts here, the white portion, if you like, represents the fish that would be expected to be harvested from well-managed coral reefs. The green proportion is the gap, and as you can see, we're proposing that tuna be used to fill that gap. And the good news is that if you look on the bottom line there, that the percentages of the tuna required to do that in terms of the current industrial catch are extremely low. 20% in 2020 and up to 6% by 2035. So, excuse me. I had a flu last week, so I'm very pleased to be standing here, but you'll have to forgive my voice. There are 2 really good win-win adaptations that we can base around tuna. And the first is by using what is known as fish aggregating devices, commonly known as FADs in the region. Tuna have a habit of milling around floating objects, and so the technology has learned to mimic that process. They anchor these devices close to reefs, but not so close that they attract the reef fish. And it just increases the probability that people can paddle out in their canoes and catch a tuna, something that's very hard to do when the tuna are normally moving past. This is a real win-win adaptation, because as coral reefs degrade and communities learn to fish in a new way, populations will be growing, reefs will be producing less, but here's a way where coastal people can catch tuna to fill that gap. But throughout the region, urban centres are growing rapidly. And so we need to do something for urban populations as well. And a feature of the industrial fishery here helps out. The industrial fishery is based mainly on large purse seine vessels. When their holds are full, they're not allowed to tranship at sea. They have to come into the port where they can be expected, and as they sort their catches out from their holds to go into the fish cargo vessels, a lot of undersized tuna that have perhaps been crushed in nets that aren't acceptable to the canneries, are coming ashore and being sold at local markets. So there's a real opportunity here to make that process much more efficient, to have better storage on land, to help the small holders do better business. But skipjack tuna itself is on the move. And so here's some modelling from Patrick Lahode, which is showing by 2050 there's going to be a progressive eastward distribution of tuna. It's not going to disappear from all the countries that currently depend on it, but countries in the east will actually expect to make larger tuna catches. Those in the west will have to introduce some policies to actually make the most of tuna, fulfilling this gap in food security. And recently, the Pacific Island prime ministers and presidents last year developed this new regional roadmap for Pacific fisheries. And I'm very pleased to say that they've allocated 40,000 tonnes a year of tuna per year by 2020 to be used for domestic food security. Other things they can do would be to use their licence fees that they get from the distant water fishing nations fishing for tuna to build the national infrastructure of fish aggregating devices. And they could also mandate a minimum number of transshipments to be made in their ports so that people in urban areas have got access to those tuna as well. But look, just a couple of slides to close. I've focused on the Pacific Islands because that's a part of the world I know, but there is a bigger picture here. Another 75 million tonnes of fish is going to be required to provide 20% of global dietary protein by 2050. There's actually a lot of optimism that fish can actually be produced through aquaculture. Everyone acknowledges that there's going to be climate change uncertainty, and we can't say that for sure. But one of the things that doesn't really seem to come through in these papers is that there hasn't really been an analysis of how pathogens, parasites, and toxic algae, which we would expect to be on the move, could actually affect the scope for aquaculture to produce all that fish by 2050 for 9 billion people. In a related area, I'm a fisheries person, but here's a slide on agriculture. We have similar problems, Will changes to the distribution and abundance of pollinators, pathogens, animal pests and weeds reduce the capacity of agriculture to feed people. FAO is doing some good work on the effect of climate change on pollinators. There's also a very good program underway by the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, one of their large cooperative research programs called Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security, and I've put the website there, and I encourage any of you who are interested in this issue to look at that. So just to wrap up, I hope that the examples that I've shown you from the Solomon Islands and the Pacific give some hope. There can be win-win adaptations, and I just encourage those of you who are working in food systems to look for similar adaptations where you work. Thank you very much.